Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast. I think I said this week's wink.
You know me too well. I'm on your brain.
This week's.
I'm flattered.
I have with me my frequent co-host, W.F. Twyman Jr., who goes by Wink. And this week we have Jon Haveman. He's joining us to talk about affirmative action. Let me tell you a little bit about Jon. I'm really excited, Jon, to have you on. Jon is a principal at Marin Economics Consulting. Did I say that right?
Well, Marin, but that's
Marin. Okay.
Okay.
He was a former senior economist with the President's Council of Economic Advisors and an economist with the Federal Trade Commission. And how I know Jon is I've heard he started something called the Need Delegation. And Jon, you can tell us a little bit more about that. But he is out there with this great group of economists, and they come and speak on a variety of issues. And how I know Jon is not only through that delegation, but also Jon came and spoke on the Black-White inequality gap. And I found it fascinating. And the conversation ended up leading to issues of affirmative action. And my own issues of affirmative action and my own thoughts on it are somewhat unformed. I've got a few. We'll get into it. But I really,
Sure.
Jon, I wanted to hear from you. I thought you had some really good arguments. But before we do that, the first question is, what are we drinking for this conversation? And Wink, I have to tell you something. I have to apologize to you because last week I was in Texas at 11:30 when we filmed, and it's 9:30 in California. I'm in California this week, and you had water, and I kind of made fun of you because it was bland. And here I am in California, and it's 9:30, and I'm like, okay, probably not the right time for alcohol. That said, I did find in my parents' liquor cabinet some Baileys, so I put a little Baileys in my coffee. That's
Oh,
me.
well, good. Well, good.
There.
All right. Well, I decided to step up my game, Jen, in light of last week. I actually have a shot of brandy. Uh, I, as you might know, I had written an informal novel about the first Black lawyer, and one of the common things they do to break the ice was to have a shot of brandy. So I decided it might be an appropriate thing. But yeah, I'm out of character, right?
I love that. That is awesome. Jon, can you beat that?
a shot of brandy sounds pretty good. But, if I had my druthers, I'd probably be here with a vodka tonic instead.
Maybe a little later in the day. I know we usually, like I said, I'm the one at the advantage, usually recording from Texas
Right.
where it's brunch,
Right.
you know?
Let's
So-
do this from the East Coast next time, where it'll be.
Absolutely. So with that said, yeah, with that introduction, Jon, just would love to hear more from you and get a little bit more of your understanding of your ideas on affirmative action and what we're doing and how we can do better.
All right, Jennifer. Well, thanks so much for having me here. Really looking forward to this conversation. I am, as Jen mentioned, the executive director of NEED, the National Economic Education Delegation, and that's really my effort to get economists out into the wild and actually talking to people, right? Because we know a ton about economic policy issues. The electorate doesn't know very much about it, and as a consequence, politicians get away with murder. Right? They get to use economics for their own personal agenda, sort of as a weapon for their own personal agenda, rather than as a tool for social good. And I kind of figure that if economists got out and told people what we knew, instead of publishing in esoteric journals and moving on, then maybe the electorate might stand up a little bit more often when their politicians are spouting off, things like trickle-down economics, about which there has never been an economic analysis that suggests that it even remotely works. Right. So as a part of this effort, I've gotten involved in racial issues and the economics surrounding racial issues. The black-white wealth gap just jumped right out at me. Oh my gosh, white households have on average 7 to 8 times more wealth than do black households. And that got me looking into more disparities, and disparities exist everywhere you look. From life expectancy to college graduation to access to healthcare. And as a part of looking at this, I then dove into the history of policymaking in the United States. And we are what I guess now 402 years into a history of racial discrimination that did not end with the Civil War. Policies that were very discriminatory lasted, no surprise, for a very long time in the South. The North, was also a discriminatory place and turned a blind eye to what was going on in the South until the 1960s. So it was sort of that exploration of history and the observation of all of the inequities and differences in outcomes for what are observationally, other than race, identical people. That led me to I guess my views on affirmative action. And as an economist, I always start with efficiency and equity. And maybe I'm naive, but I think that affirmative action goes over the bar both in terms of equity and efficiency. Because of our history of racial discrimination, because of differences in starting points, really super smart Black kids are not going to have the same opportunities as really super smart white kids. And from overall economic efficiency, that's not good. The economy could grow more quickly if we had a more equitable place, right? And on equity grounds, well, it's clear that we have lots of work to do. And then the history that I mentioned, the GI Bill. I learned all kinds of things about discrimination in laws and bills and spending that we thought were terrific, right? The GI Bill, long credited with creating the middle class, but it created a white middle class. Access to education for GIs who were Black was much more limited than for white GIs. Access to housing, not only to the money, but to actually buy the housing. And we've all heard stories about Levittown on Long Island. Well, that got built only with the proviso that none of the houses were sold to Black GIs. Right? So just an enormous amount of discrimination. And then we got to the 60s and we got a lot of laws that put everybody on equal footing. And I don't think that laws that are arguably not very well enforced and not written well enough to create the desired outcome, even if they were the perfect laws saying everybody should be treated equally, we've got a foot race where white Americans are starting on the starting lines, and Black and Hispanic Americans are starting well behind whites in this country. And so affirmative action, in my view, is one way to sort of move everybody a little bit closer to the same starting line.
What can I ask you before ask for any thoughts on Wink? What does, like, for you, what does affirmative action look like? Is it just simply adding like grade inflation or a test inflation? What is it? How is it actually implemented?
Sure. So at a fundamental notional level, affirmative action means taking steps, positive steps, to eliminate the gaps that exist. At a more concrete level, I'm all in favor of race-based admissions policies at institutions of higher education, and I'm all in favor of race-based preferences in terms of government contracting. And I think that both of those two policies in particular have the potential to lift up folks that haven't had the kind of opportunity that white Americans have.
And Wink, I know you've got some thoughts on affirmative action that you and I have talked about. What do you think?
Oh, and Jen, thank you again for this platform. I appreciate that. And it's a pleasure to meet someone who's an economist. You saw my face light up when I heard that Jon was an economist.
It doesn't always happen, Wink.
Okay, that's true. That's true.
We've got a lawyer and an economist. It sounds like there's a
Yeah.
bar joke in there somewhere.
That's right. That's right. That deserves a drink, right? But now I have fond memories of Econ 101 and 102 at college. So, but I wanted to, and Jen knows this already, but Jen invited me to come because she wanted my perspective or my thoughts. And I made it clear to Jen that, my thoughts are not hard-edged on affirmative action. They're kind of an imperfect muddle, Jon. And so let me give you the backstory for why my thoughts are kind of a muddle. When I was in high school, I remember maybe it must have been 11th grade or 12th grade, just sort of sitting down. I was in, I think it was AP English class, and I just sort of sat down and thought about the whole issue of affirmative action. And even then, in high school, I was kind of torn because on the one hand, I felt it was very important for there to be some type of recruitment efforts and outreach to overcome systems of social segregation. There's no question, no doubt, that too often Black Americans and white Americans live different social lives. So you'll see Black neighborhoods, you'll see Black fraternities, you'll see Black sororities, you'll see groups like Jack and Jill, you'll see the National Bar Association, which is the Black equivalent of the American Bar Association. You'll see Black churches in the South and the North as well. And so, because of those realities of social lived segregation or just separate lives, I decided, well, yeah, affirmative action makes sense to kind of break that nut, if you will, because if you don't do anything to break that nut of social separation, you'll just replicate divisions and possibly disadvantage. In other words, an equally qualified person who's Black may be less likely to be aware of opportunities compared to someone who's white and equally situated. But on the other hand, as I thought about this in high school, it occurred to me that I really felt a great revulsion against the idea of quotas. Quotas seemed to me to be very dehumanizing. And I thought about it this way. It seemed to me that if you set quotas for a group, any group, and Jewish Americans tell you about this from the 1920s at Harvard and Ivy League colleges, you set a cap. You set an artificial cap on aspiration and ambition. So my idea was always that quotas were bad because why should Blacks be only 10% at Harvard Law School? Why shouldn't Blacks be 25% or 30% or 50%? Why shouldn't half of the faculty at Harvard Law School be Black? So that the idea being, to me at least, quotas set an artificial cap on Black aspiration and ambition. And so that was my opposition to affirmative action. So I was nuanced. And over the years, I'm now approaching 60, on the high side of 50, as they say on Star Trek. But at this age, my muddled thoughts continue, Jon, in all honesty. They do. You mentioned some things I just wanted to lightly touch upon. It's only a 30-minute podcast, so I'll resist the urge to give a dissertation. But you mentioned something which I thought was quite interesting. You said affirmative action was good because it helps us to create the desired outcome, that we need positive steps to eliminate the gaps. And as a result, you favored race-based preferences like admissions and college and government contracting. Is that a correct recounting of what you said, I think?
Yeah.
I took notes. Okay, great. So my sense is, and I'll just give you one example. Let's take someone I know. I know someone who, to use your term, a super bright Black kid. So this kid received an offer of admission to a number of colleges, including an Ivy League college, yay, and a solid state university in the Southwest. I looked into that, and I discovered that when I looked at the super bright kid's stats, he would have been, I'll say he would have been competitive in terms of his SAT score. But in terms of his grade point average, I was horrified. He was probably at the absolute bottom of the admitted class at this Ivy League school. And I thought to myself, that's a trap, to quote another Star Trek episode. It's a trap. Because if he had gone to the Ivy League school, even though he may have had the cognitive ability measured through SAT scores to be competitive, he wasn't self-disciplined in high school. He would have palled around, and if his grades were any indication, he would have brought up the rear of that Ivy League class. That would have destroyed his self-confidence, his ambition. He would have been resentful, and he would have entered adult life a broken person in spirit. Now, the story has a happy ending, Jon, which is why I bring this up. He decided to attend that state school in the American Southwest. And at that state school, looking at his SAT score and his grades, he was in the top 5% of the entering class. And guess what? He knocked out of the ballpark in college. This kid was like Mr. Man, big man on campus. There was an award he did not win. He was known by the deans of the school. He was known by the president of the school. He was like probably one of the top 9 or 10 kids at this major state university in terms of his leadership ability and his community service and grade point average. And so when he left college, he was raring to go. This guy was going to conquer the world. And I thought that was a good ending. But that was my point, is that because of the good intentions of affirmative action at that Ivy League school, his life choices might have been twisted and contorted. He may have been lured into making a choice that made it seem very prestigious on the front end, but would have crippled his spirit in the back end. Whereas by going to a place where he was clearly going to dominate from the get-go, he was ready to conquer the world as an adult. So that's one of my beefs with affirmative action. Like I said, I don't have a hard-nosed position. I'm still in a muddle, but that's one story that I know of personally, which warns me of the downside of good intentions of affirmative action at places like Ivy League schools.
Right. So
go ahead, John. Well, I might have been take us in a different direction. So why don't you go ahead and then I'll jump in.
Okay, I have a couple of reactions to that. One, affirmative action gave your friend opportunity, and opportunity.
Oh, right, yeah.
Sometimes knocks, but maybe you don't want to open the door, and so he had a choice, and he made what appears to be a really good choice.
Oh, you bet.
But you don't know. He might have gone to Harvard. You said his SAT scores were right up there.
Competitive.
But he might have gone to the Ivy League school, whatever it was, and shined there.
Well, John, I hear you, John. I hear you. I love you. You're an economist. How can I not love you? But I do think that grade point averages throughout 4 years of high school are some indication of one's grit, one's stick-to-itness. And so I think that I credit that to some degree, I think.
You're probably right. You're probably right. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong, but it creates opportunity, right? And think about another super smart kid that's, for whatever reason, they weren't counseled that your grades matter in high school in order to get into college. And they have, 1440 SATs or higher. And that's the reflection of their ability. Mm-hmm. And they have the opportunity where they otherwise wouldn't without affirmative action to go to an Ivy League school, and they shine, perhaps become president.
Let me share with you another story. One of the great things about almost approaching 60 is that I literally become Black history. I've lived so long that I've seen so many things. Here's another quick story, John, for you. I want your take on this. So, I grew up in a small town in suburban Virginia. I was a Republican suburb, and our school was great. I mean, it wasn't like at the level of a private school in Richmond, Virginia, but it was good. And so I went off to University of Virginia for college. And I met and became friends with someone who was from the city of Richmond, Virginia. Now, at that time, the city of Richmond, Virginia, the public schools were 82% Black. And this particular gentleman graduated from Maggie Walker High School. At that time, it was an inner city public school, 98% Black. So we became pals and talked everything. And he was pre-med, and he was full of himself because he was #1 in his class at Maggie Walker High School. I was not #1 in my class, far from it. So I was kind of impressed with him. But his SAT score stood in my mind. As I remember, it was 990 total. I was hundreds of points above that, but I was far from #1 in my class. Make no mistake about that. So I wondered to myself, how will this turn out? Because UVA had created, in a sense, a social experiment. Unknowingly, they had admitted 2 people, as you might say, 2 super bright Black kids. One from a suburban small town suburb who was not at the top of his class, but had pretty good SAT scores. Another kid from the inner city, #1 in his class, valedictorian, only knew success, but kind of mediocre SAT scores. Well, what happened over the course of the year, I kind of felt like, well, this is more of the same. I got to work harder than I've worked before to do well. My friend stumbled. He had difficulties. There was a cultural disconnect between his neighborhood and going to school in Charlottesville, Virginia. For me, it was more of the same. He didn't do well in his classes, and sadly, he dropped out of school after first year. I continued on my little merry way, working my tail off, and ended up going to law school. So I guess my point is, that's another example, another cautionary tale to me of how the good intention of giving my friend more opportunity created someone who dropped out after first year, whereas I didn't really need that. And so I didn't have that expectation that I was it's odd. I didn't have the self sense I was the winner because I knew I was not at the top of the class. I had to work very hard. But he had the sense that he was a winner because he was number one. So what's your thought on that? Your take on that?
Yeah, and so you're talking about what is labeled the mismatch problem.
Okay, I didn't even know it at the time, back in 1980, whatever.
Mismatch theory, yeah.
The mismatch theory, yeah.
And actually, John, before you start, because I hope that you address this, this was one of my things, was there, with the mismatch theory, one of the things that it shows is the graduation rate for kids who are mismatched is no, it doesn't. Okay, John's shaking his head for you listeners. Okay,
Trust
good.
John, he's the economist.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's why I'm asking you that. So let me, because I think you were going there. So let me jump in.
Sure.
There's this sense that what I've heard, and please, yes, jump in, John, and correct me, is there's this, the graduation rate goes down if kids are mismatched, and then that you've got more of kids dropping out and whatnot. So those are the numbers that I heard, and I'm looking forward to being corrected about that. But and then after that, John, after I hear from you, I want to talk about something before we end on meritocracy in general. So, John, yeah, graduation rate. So that's a fallacy.
Yeah. So for every controversial issue, there are two literatures, right? One which is genuine and has it right, and one which is trying to argue the opposite viewpoint. Right. I'm not going to tell you which is which, well, except in this instance, there's definitely literature that says, oh, the mismatch, that's bad for kids. That's bad for kids. Don't do it. Lots of methodological errors. There's a broader strain of research that looks at mismatch and shows that, on average, better than average, kids will step up to the plate. Right, they'll rise to the occasion, the opportunity, and outperform expectations. Right, because peer pressure, social pressure matters a lot. Now, I get uncomfortable really making that claim, and pounding my fist about it with respect to affirmative action, because if you take the situation, so I was reading about Michelle Obama's experience, right? Being one of the few Black students at Princeton, everybody looked at her. And, is that because she's Black? Is it because they're saying, oh, she is only here because of affirmative action? There are cultural issues, right? And, the meritocracy is kind of a fallacy. George Bush went to Harvard, not because he deserved it.
Right.
Yeah, Yale undergrad, Harvard Business School, I think.
Right.
So mismatch for white kids. White families are all over it. Yes, send my kid to the best place they can get. Yes, he's dumb as a stick, but send him to Harvard.
You see that all the time, and you see that with athletics as well, right? I mean, you've got kids who come in who don't really deserve to be there because they want to have a winning team. But that's funny, because then let's, on that sports analogy. So if we wanted to make sports diverse, like basketball is mainly there. I mean, some of the best basketball players statistically are Black. So if we were going to say, well, let's make basketball more diverse, then we'd have to let in more white kids into the basketball,
Right. So that's very different. The literature on diversity at colleges and universities is pretty favorable.
Mhm.
Jen, can I turn
Mm.
to, because I so love economists, can I ask a question in the
Go
area of
for
economists? Thanks.
it.
So John, one of the things that fascinated me, I remember reading the story a few days ago, and you probably are aware of the issue. The issue is the Federal Reserve and the number of Black staff economists at the Federal Reserve. There are probably 417, I think, or
Mhm.
18 staff economists at the Federal Reserve. And of that number, how many do you think are Black in the year 2021?
10
Try two.
to
Two. All right. Now, here's my question to John. Because remember, I'm muddled. I have a muddled position, and I oppose quotas, but I support outreach. How will affirmative action ever effectively solve that problem if only, I think it was 7 Black women received a PhD in economics in the year 2017, and you have 417 economists on the staff? How will affirmative action ever solve a problem like that in our lifetime?
uh, now you're
Yeah.
hitting too close to home. No, I think the problems in the economics profession are very comparable to the problems in broader society, only probably a little bit more extreme. Right? I
I
mean
agree.
the economics profession has been old white men for as long as there's been dirt. So so it's a more extreme problem. I think that affirmative action has the potential to bring smart minorities into institutes of higher learning and expose them to economists and economics, and find that they have a real propensity for it. Um, Probably not. There are two kinds of people in the world: those who get economics and love it, and those who don't.
True statement. True statement. True statement. As someone who earned an A in Econ 101 and an A in Econ 102, I enjoyed economics, but I knew my limits. And when I took Econ, I think it was 301 with Herbert Stein, formerly with
Huh?
the Council. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had reached my limit. I decided, no, no,
That was
no.
it.
This is not for me. This is not for
But
me.
that's
So,
that's a really interesting point though, because we not only with race but with women, right? So there's a big push to get women into STEM, which includes economics and whatnot. But
right.
there's also this discussion on, I mean, as a woman who actually I am good at economics. I went to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and you have to take you get your degree in international econ. So I've got a little bit of a background there. It's more
Mm,
30,000 foot econ versus the nitty gritty.
right.
But I my passion is international relations. My passion is more connection. And I know that I don't want to talk about gender in this conversation, but I think that it's hard. That's my problem with also affirmative action so far is like, you're pushing these women, you're pushing maybe, I don't know, people who think differently to think the way of old white men to use your phrase. I don't, and so you kind of putting this pressure on you know groups of people to say, hey, yeah, I could be an economist. I don't want to be an economist. And so that's another thing with affirmative action that but I'm gonna veer off here for a second because I do want to get to this before we're done. Here's one of the problems that I have with affirmative action in general and more meritocracy, or affirmative action specifically, and more meritocracy in general. And Wink, you sent me something last week that said meritocracy was racist, which is funny. We'll have to put that in our podcast notes. But here's my problem: is what I think is that I went to my undergrad was Trinity University. It was the best decision I ever made. I from California, got into a bunch of UC schools, could have gone to Berkeley, could have gone to a couple other really big schools. But I did better at Trinity, and it set me up
Mm,
for later on. And so what bothers me is with affirmative action is really focused on like the Ivies, like let's get more Black people, brown people, whatever into the Ivies. Why that elitism of Harvard? I mean, why can't we say, hey, you would do better? Like your original story, you would do better at a state school. For me, I would do better at a smaller liberal arts. That's how I learned. And so I feel like we're not really serving anyone when we've got that, like it's Harvard or nothing.
if the person I'm thinking of had gone to Williams, uh-oh. that Ivy League school.
We're going to do some research to find out who
right. He would have been forgotten, like a lost face in the crowd. But at the school this person went to, as I say, he walked among the deans. He even had a commencement day dinner with the guest speaker, the commencement speaker. He was so like known and revered on campus. That never would have been his experience at the Ivy League place. So that, I think that supports Jen's point there.
Well, but so I'll go back to my assertion that it provides opportunity, right? And maybe for some it pushes them in the wrong direction, and that's unfortunate. I'm not here to say that affirmative action and taking advantage of it is in the best interests of everybody, right? If you get the opportunity, go. I'm not saying that's true, but what I'm saying is that I think that probably on average, this is my reading of the literature, on average, it's going to lead to better outcomes for people who otherwise, perhaps deserve to be at Williams, Harvard, Princeton, where have you, but would not get in. Partly because of bias in the admissions problem, perhaps. Partly because they didn't go to schools that really prioritized education and grades, because they didn't have access, but they have the capacity.
I think that's key, the capacity. That's so key. I agree with that, Jon. I was reading this story the other day. There's a school in Philadelphia, the William D. Kelly School. And I think only, let me get the percentages right, only 3%, it's a 94% Black school, elementary school. Only 3% of the kids are proficient in mathematics at the age of in sixth grade. 3%. Now, proficiency is a country mile from the level of mathematical ability needed for a PhD in economics to work for the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C.
Right.
So I guess my point is, if you're dealing with a cohort where only 3% of the kids are simply proficient in the sixth grade, let alone at the level of a PhD in economics for the Federal Reserve, I think it's going to be a long haul. Personally, Jon, and remember, I'm muddled. I don't have a hard line position on this, but I really think it's like a pyramid. Before we worry about integrating the august economics staff at the Federal Reserve, I think we should first focus on the base of the pyramid, meaning 0 through 3, preschool and elementary school. When my children were born, I had just read this fascinating book, and I couldn't remember the name of it. But the book said there was a direct correlation between the number of words a baby heard between the birth and the age of 3, and their later cognitive ability and intellectual development. So my wife and I read as many books as we could to our kids when they were, 1 year old, 2, 3. The very first book, Jon, I read to my son. He's going to be embarrassed. The very first book I read was a treatise on constitutional law by Larry Tribe, because I wanted to set high expectations for the kid, right? But I oftentimes wonder, would we do a better job of uplifting kids, as you want to do? And I certainly agree. Trust me, I want to see that happen. But would our resources be better devoted to the age of 0 to 3? And making sure little Black babies hear as many words as they can. That way they'll be primed for preschool. They'll know their colors. They'll know their numbers. And that way, when they're in elementary school, we can tell them, aim high. Don't you try to just be proficient in first grade. I want you to aim for second grade. And when you're in the second grade, aim for third grade. That was me, by the way. When I was in the first grade, I read second grade stuff, second grade, third grade stuff, because it just seemed like a way to challenge myself. And I think more little Black kids need to challenge themselves, not have standards lowered for them at the base of that pyramid I'm talking about.
So a couple of things. One, my anecdote, I heard the same analysis about words. And so my son's mother and I, we talk to him all of the time.
Right.
To the point where now he talks at us all of the time. He's 12, and if he would talk a little bit less.
Well, we have the same problem.
But I don't want my position here to be misunderstood as saying, let's do affirmative action and walk away.
Yep.
Mhm.
I am so far away from that. No, I agree with you 100%, right? We need to start off with more words being thrown at
Oh,
kids.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but we need to start further with more moms and dads
Yes.
having the time to talk to their kids.
Yeah.
Yep. I agree. Totally.
It's
Totally.
So
Totally on board.
many more black kids are growing up in families where mom and dad are both working 2 jobs than white kids.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
many more black kids are growing up in families without dad than
Mhm.
white kids, right? So you've just cut the
And that's
number
a
of words in half.
key point, because if
Yes.
you've got two parents in the household, that's twice the number of words in theory you're going to hear, right? So I think that's
100%.
all good. And not just that, when you have two parents in the household as a little kid, you learn about different ways of navigating the world. Mom may be like a stern disciplinarian, policewoman like character. Dad may be more of a poet, an artist, creative type.
Are you
And so you learn
speaking
that.
from experience, Wink?
What else, Jen? But it redounds. It's such a beautiful thing, right? To have parents that are so different, because it redounds to the benefit of the kids. The kids grow accustomed, right, to seeing
Right.
there are multiple ways. Whereas if you only have a single parent, I think kids don't see that on a lived basis every day, and I think that's a detriment. I think I could be wrong.
And
I,
I've got a statistic for that. For
I
kids
agree with
are.
you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Kids are of all races are 400% more likely to be poor in a single family household.
Sure.
400%. So, I mean, for me, and Winky, you and I heard this term the other day when we were talking. I believe, and I hear you, John. I know that you're not just saying
yeah,
we've got to start,
yeah.
but I mean, affirmative education is where I really focus. And then at some point, if we do affirmative education, affirmative action is no longer needed, you know?
Right, right. And let me go back to Wink's point about resources, right? I don't think it's the same set of resources, right? It's not like we're spending money and getting Black and Latino kids to Ivy League schools that we could take and we could devote to getting more words to kids or to more preschool for minority 4-year-olds. It's a different pool of resources. And we shouldn't say affirmative action is bad because we should be doing this. We should be saying we should be doing both of those things.
No, I accept that. Yeah.
Be doing a huge laundry list of things, right? And if mom and dad have to work 2 jobs and they can't get words to the kids, then we need to set it up so that mom and dad don't have to work 2 jobs. And whether that's more labor unions that are inclusive, whether that's higher minimum wage, there are a ton of different policies that need to be pursued in order to make this society more equitable. My starting point matters.
Yeah,
it does.
And so what I would love to do is change the starting point. We can't do anything about the starting point for people who are already born. But let's change
Right.
it for those who are coming.
Right. Right.
And starting point matters enormously in where you end up.
Well, can I ask you a question then, John? Would you say with starting point, is it even about race? Is it more about socioeconomics? So, I mean, there's plenty of studies that show, crime from, there was a study in Columbus, Ohio, that showed a same number of like low income white neighborhoods and low income black neighborhoods, and the crime statistics and the starting point and all everything, they were about even. So it really seems to be more of an issue of socioeconomic. So would you approve of a socioeconomic affirmative action type program?
Well, I think that we need affirmative action that's class-based as well as race-based.
Okay.
Right, we're getting further away from an equitable society along both of those lines than we have been. But there's also a lot of evidence that Black families are more likely to buy houses in neighborhoods that are objectively inferior to neighborhoods where a white family with the same level of income would buy a house. Right, so there are lots of inequities that aren't class-based that remain in our society.
John, I want to ask you a
and
question.
again, I think back to 400 years of white affirmative action, And Wink, you mentioned that you're pushing 60, and so you embody Black history.
Right,
Well,
right.
I'm pushing 60, and I embody white history, and I don't like what I'm
Right,
looking.
right, right. I
Um,
hear you. I hear you. It's interesting, John, and I repeat for the sake of clarity that my views are not, strong either way. But I do think there are lessons I can take from things that I have seen and witnessed in my lifetime. So you mentioned at one point, you mentioned um, the idea that these disparities continued post Civil War, racial discrimination, and that it continued through things like the GI Bill, right? And presumably that kept Black people from acquiring assets and wealth, which is why we are here today with our net disparities. In your research, have you looked into stories of Black families before the Civil War that acquired assets,
mhm.
or Black families that acquired assets that stayed in the family through the generations? Have you looked at people like Senator Brooke, who did benefit from the GI Bill and got a college degree and a law degree because of the GI Bill? I was just wondering, how do you reconcile stories of accumulation of assets and wealth over time in some Black families with the idea that there's just been this continual racial discrimination post Civil War?
Well, so if we go to the day after the Civil War ended, right? There are 4 million freed Black slaves in the southern part of the United States, and a much smaller number in the North. Some of whom have accumulated significant wealth. So the day the Civil War ended, there are different starting points. Um, and there are lots of stories of freed slaves accumulating wealth, but there are lots of stories where that wealth was subsequently taken away. And we can start with 40 acres and a mule, right? You get your 40 acres, that's wealth, right? Where in my
Hmm.
high school, the story didn't go all the way through, and it didn't tell us that those 40 acres were taken away and given back to the former slave owners.
Right.
The Freedmen's Bank, right? That was designed as a very safe place for freed slaves to put their money and save up and accumulate wealth. Well, until rich white people got a hold of it and invested all the money in the railroads, which was a huge bubble at the time,
Hmm.
and poof, poof, there went half of the accumulated Black wealth in the United States.
Hmm.
And those aren't the only two stories like that. So there's a long history of denying access to wealth accumulating activities, and once wealth accumulates, taking it away.
But there,
And
but
that,
as you acknowledge, there are also stories of the wealth not being taken away and remaining. I think of my Jen's heard the story before, so she's bored, I'm sure. I think of my grandmother's grandfather. He was born a slave, and after the Civil War, he accumulated about 550 acres of land in two counties in Virginia, and that land was left to his 10 children, and they left land to their children. And I actually grew up within sight of my great great grandfather's old estate. And parts of that land still stay in the family to this day. So that's what, about four generations of land in a single Black family that's kind of remained intact more or less. Um, and there are probably other Black families in the rural South, in Virginia, because I make the difference between Virginia and the Deep South. But I sometimes wonder whether or not their stories are also recognized in the public square. Stories where there are generational transfers of wealth over time. Uh, does that make sense? So
uh,
how can I put it? It's kind of like when I hear your account, which is true, I recognize it as truth. But when I think about my own family and some families of other people that I know, it doesn't ring true, right? It seems distant. It seems different. I know a woman, I won't mention names, Jen, but I know a woman whose family has been propertied since 1790. Black woman. Her ancestor in 1790 became relatively wealthy and started up a carpentry shop in South Carolina. His son-in-law became wealthy and owned 15 homes at the time of his death in 1845. His son became wealthy. His son-in-law became one of the wealthiest blacks in Charleston. Their son became one of the most educated people in South Carolina. Their children moved to New York City and continue to develop assets so that today, in that black family, I mean, they can look at 7, 8, 9 generations of black accumulation of wealth. Where do they fit into your account?
Well, even today with all the disparities in starting points, there are enormously successful Black Americans, whether it's in entertainment or finance, right? They exist, but the probability of that happening is so much lower for somebody born Black in America than it is for somebody born white.
That's so funny because as Jen knows, to me they're just family. I don't think of them as extraordinarily outlier type of people. Is this interesting? Is this interesting, Jen?
Well, I'm almost done with my drink. So, do you guys want to any final thoughts? Wink on.
Well, I want to say, John, thank you. I've enjoyed this. Always a pleasure to talk with an economist, and I like the idea that I came into this conversation truly in a muddle, and my muddle has been constant for at least 40 or 50 years, and I like the idea that we looked at things with nuance and complexity, that we share the same good outcome, which is the uplift of people and the erasing of barriers due to race. That's important. Uh, I may have my quibbles sometimes at the edges, but that's just human nature.
Yeah. Well, Wink, I've enjoyed it very much as well. And I will say that my view may be unmuddled in part because of my naivete, right? And I'm in the early stages of really truly forming it. But I tend to run with the evidence that's presented to me.
Good.
And evidence. My evidence is very different from yours.
So interesting.
And I think that, like what John, knowing Wink well, I think one of and Wink. I don't mean to speak for you, so correct me if I'm wrong, and then we'll end on this. But I think and affirmative action plays into this. But Wink really has a problem with the idea that and we hear a lot in the public square on oppression, 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 and he has a feeling, or we agree on this point, that when you're told that nothing else matters, blackness is
Mm,
oppression, then
mm,
you're not lifted up. So what our voices and what we try to do is like bring up the voices of resilience and strength and whatnot. And so, insofar as affirmative action plays into this, you aren't. You didn't do that good, so let's help you. Versus again, what we were talking about, affirmative education. No, you've got it. We're going to start from the beginning, which I think we're all with that part. We're going to start from the beginning, and all kids have the exact same equal opportunities. And so I think that's where
Yep.
it comes
Can I
from.
can I clarify something that I just said?
Please.
go right ahead, please.
What I said about evidence could be taken as my saying that my evidence is right and yours is wrong, Wink. And that
Oh,
wasn't my
well,
intention. My intention
you-
was to say that you have access. You've had access in your nearly 60 years to evidence that I haven't had access.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
and
I
John,
appreciate learning from your experiences.
you know what? Doesn't that go back to my experience in high school? Remember when I thought about this for the first time, on the one hand, I did oppose quotas, but on the other hand, I recognized that there were things like social divisions and social separate lives that needed to be broken through outreach and recruitment. This is an example of that, right? You don't have the lived experience that I do, right? And so that's one of the benefits of bringing more people to the table, is that you hear those nuances that you wouldn't otherwise think of. I mean, and you're not to be blamed, not at all. We can only speak from what we know. I just think it's an interesting thing, and this is a subject for another podcast. But I find too often that some of the loudest voices in the public discourse, and we know who they are, no need to say them, but I think sometimes the loudest voices probably speak from their lived perspective, but it's just one perspective. And
Mhm.
so I always get dismayed when people claim that Blackness is oppression, nothing else matters. I know someone who said that on April, I think it was April 25th, 2018 or something. I wrote it down. It was so monumental to me because it was so opposite to everything I knew, everything my mom knew, my grandparents. That's one of my fears, John, is that in the desire to right historic wrongs, we erase memory of generations of heroic Black accomplishment and development of assets and wealth, that they become beside the point to the grander narrative of liberation. And that bothers me because these real people who lived real lives and they invested all they knew for the coming of a better time for their descendants. And who are we in 2021 to not remember the sacrifices of a great great grandfather or a great grandmother? Just my thought.
Yeah, no, and I respect that. I respect that. But you know, in moving forward, I view the more important issue of not trying to right past wrongs. We can't do that. But to try and eradicate it from current reality.
Sounds good to me. I
and the
support that.
future. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I support that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Would
All
you,
right, you guys.
well, in closing, once
Okay.
again, Jen, thank you very much. I know you want to wrap it up. Jen and I have a bad habit of talking a long
Well,
time sometimes.
we always say we're going to try to do 30 minutes, and then
Yeah,
2 hours later.
I think I could sit here with the two of you all day and we could go nicely. So let me say thank you, Jen, as well. I appreciate the invitation. Really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say hold my drink and the conversation gets real.